Welcome back to another epic journey through the corridors of time. Today, we re-exploring one of history's most haunting mysteries, the complete disappearance of an empire that once rivaled Rome itself. Imagine a civilization so thoroughly destroyed that almost everything we know about it comes from the words of its enemies. Picture a city so utterly annihilated that Roman soldiers literally plowed salt into its earth, cursing the very ground where millions once lived, loved, and built one of the ancient world's greatest powers. The Kingdom of Carthage stood for nearly 7 centuries as the Mediterranean's supreme naval and commercial power. Its merchants sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic. Its generals commanded armies that brought Rome to its knees. Its wealth made it the envy of the ancient world. And then, in a campaign of destruction so complete that it shocked even the ancient world, it vanished. Not just defeated, not merely conquered, but erased. Deliberately, systematically, and almost successfully removed from human memory. How does an empire that controlled the Mediterranean for generations simply disappear? What led to such complete annihilation that we must reconstruct its history from the accounts of those who destroyed it? Why did Rome fear Carthage so deeply that destroying it wasn't enough? They needed to obliterate its very memory. Today, we're piecing together the extraordinary story of Carthage, from its legendary founding by a refugee queen to its apocalyptic final hours. This is the story of how an empire vanishes from history. Chapter 1. The Phoenix Queen. The year is 814 BCE, and a Phoenician princess stands on the North African coast, watching the sun set over waters that will one day bear her empire's name. She has fled her homeland of Tyre after her brother, King Pygmalion, murdered her husband to seize his wealth. But Alyssa, whom history will remember as Dido, is not merely a refugee. She is about to found the greatest commercial empire the ancient world has ever seen. The story of Carthage's founding blends history and legend so thoroughly that separating them becomes impossible. But the legend itself reveals truths about Carthaginian identity. When Dido arrives on the North African coast, she negotiates with the local Berber king Irbis for land. He agrees to grant her as much territory as can be covered by a single ox hide. It seems a meager offer, but Dido demonstrates the cunning that will characterize her people for centuries. She cuts the ox hide into the thinnest possible strips and lays them end to end, encompassing enough land to build a fortified city. This city, called Carthage, New City in the Phoenician language, becomes Carthage. This founding legend captures something essential about the Carthaginian character: ingenuity, commercial acumen, and the ability to turn limitation into opportunity. The Phoenicians who settle here are already the Mediterranean's master traders, but distance from their Levantan homeland forces them to become something more. They transform from a colonial outpost into an independent power, maintaining Phoenician culture while adapting to African realities. The location Dido chooses proves strategically brilliant. Carthage sits on a peninsula jutting into the Mediterranean at the narrowest point between Europe and Africa. To the north lies Sicily, to the east the rich trading routes to Greece and the Levant, to the west the resource-rich coasts of Spain and the mysterious Atlantic beyond. The natural harbors can shelter hundreds of ships, and the surrounding territory proves remarkably fertile. Within generations, Carthage grows from refugee settlement to regional power. The early Carthaginians established themselves through trade rather than conquest. They inherit from their Phoenician ancestors the secrets of purple dye, made from murex shells and worth more than gold. They master glassmaking, metalworking, and shipbuilding. Most importantly, they understand something that will take other civilizations centuries to learn. Peaceful trade enriches everyone, but monopolizing trade routes enriches you more. Carthage begins establishing trading posts and colonies throughout the western Mediterranean, creating a commercial network that funnels wealth back to the mother city. By the 6th century BCE, Carthage controls trade throughout the western Mediterranean. Its ships venture beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic, sailing north to Britain for tin and south along the African coast for gold, ivory, and slaves. The city itself grows magnificent. Massive walls, some sections standing 6 stories high, protect the urban core. The circular military harbor, connected to the commercial port by a narrow channel, can house 220 warships under covered slips, hidden from enemy surveillance. At the harbor's center rises a tower from which admirals can observe the entire fleet. The population swells to perhaps 400,000 people, making Carthage one of the ancient world's largest cities. The streets climb the hill from the harbors to the Byrsa, the citadel where temples to Baal Hammon and Tanit tower over the city. Here, in these temples, Carthaginians practice rituals that will horrify their enemies and puzzle historians for millennia. The Tophet, a sacred precinct where infant remains are buried in urns, stands as archaeological evidence of either child sacrifice or a special cemetery for infants who died naturally. The debate continues today. Carthaginian society develops characteristics that distinguish it from other ancient powers. Unlike the militaristic Romans or the philosophically minded Greeks, the Carthaginians focus obsessively on commerce. Their aristocracy comprises merchant princes whose power derives from trade rather than land. Political decisions are made through a complex system involving 2 chief magistrates called Sophetes, a senate of wealthy merchants and assemblies of citizens. Democracy exists, but wealth determines influence. The Carthaginian religion remains mysterious, known primarily through hostile Greek and Roman accounts. The chief deities, Baal Hammon and his consort Tanit, demand devotion but also, if the sources can be believed, terrible sacrifice. Whether Carthaginians truly practiced child sacrifice remains history's most controversial question about them. The archaeological evidence suggests something happened in the Tophet, but whether it was systematic infanticide or a cemetery for children who died from natural causes in infancy remains disputed. The Roman and Greek sources insist on systematic child sacrifice, but they had obvious motivations to portray their enemies as barbaric. By 500 BCE, Carthage has transformed from a Phoenician colony into an imperial power in its own right. It controls most of the North African coast, southern Spain, western Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and the Balearic Islands. It has fought wars against the Greeks in Sicily, establishing itself as the Western Mediterranean's dominant force. The city's wealth becomes legendary. Merchants trading gold, silver, tin, copper, amber, ivory, and slaves. The agricultural territories around Carthage, worked by slave labor and Berber subjects, produce grain, olives, wine, and fruit in abundance. Yet for all its power and wealth, Carthage remained vulnerable in ways its leaders don't yet recognize. It rules a maritime empire, held together by naval supremacy and commercial ties rather than territorial conquest. It relies on mercenary armies rather than citizen soldiers, paying others to fight its wars. Its subject peoples remain restive, loyal only as long as Carthage can protect and profit them. And across the Mediterranean, a new power is rising in central Italy, expanding aggressively and learning to think of itself as destiny's chosen people. Rome and Carthage are about to become aware of each other, and when they do, only one will survive. Chapter 2. The First Collision. The year is 264 BCE, and the Mediterranean's 2 rising powers are about to collide over a dispute neither particularly wants. The city of Messana in northeastern Sicily has been seized by a band of Italian mercenaries called the Mamertines. When Syracuse attacks them, the Mamertines appeal for help to both Carthage and Rome. Carthage responds first, installing a garrison in Messana. But then Rome decides it cannot allow Carthage to control both sides of the Straits of Messina. Roman legions cross into Sicily, and the First Punic War begins. This conflict will last 23 years and transform both powers forever. For Carthage, it seems initially like just another war for control of Sicily, where Carthaginians and Greeks have fought for centuries. The Carthaginians possess overwhelming naval superiority. They are the Mediterranean's greatest sailors, while Romans barely have a navy at all. Surely, this war will be short. But the Romans proved to be the most dangerous enemy Carthage has ever faced, not because of their initial strength, but because of their absolute refusal to accept defeat. The early war goes badly for Rome. The Carthaginian navy dominates the seas around Sicily, and Carthaginian forces, under capable generals like Hamilcar Barca, control much of the island. But the Romans display a characteristic that will define them. They learn from defeat. A Carthaginian warship runs aground on the Italian coast. Roman engineers swarm over it, taking measurements, studying its design. Within 60 days, Rome builds an entire fleet modeled on the Carthaginian design. It's an extraordinary achievement, but the Romans still don't know how to fight at sea. Roman ingenuity provides the answer. They developed a corvus, a boarding bridge with a spike that crashes down onto enemy ships, essentially turning naval combat into land combat. When Roman Marines can board Carthaginian vessels, their superior infantry training negates Carthaginian sailing expertise. In the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE, Rome wins its first naval victory, capturing or sinking 50 Carthaginian ships. The Carthaginians are stunned. These Italian farmers have built a navy from nothing and defeated the Mediterraneans as master mariners in a single afternoon. The war drags on, becoming a grinding conflict of sieges, raids, and naval battles across Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa. Both sides exhaust themselves financially and demographically. In 256 BCE, Rome launches an invasion of Africa itself, landing near Carthage under the consul Marcus Atilius Regulus. Initially successful, Regulus advances close to Carthage, but then overreaches. The Carthaginians hire a Spartan mercenary general named Xantippus, who reorganizes their army and crushes the Roman invasion at the Battle of Bagradas. Regulus is captured, and his fate becomes one of ancient history's most debated stories. Roman sources claim he was eventually sent back to Rome to negotiate peace, promised to return to Carthage, but instead argued for continuing the war and honored his promise by returning to Carthage, where he was tortured to death. Whether this happened or is merely Roman propaganda about their own virtue, no one knows for certain. The war's turning point comes through attrition rather than dramatic victory. Both powers are exhausted, but Rome proves slightly more resilient. In 249 BCE, Carthage wins the naval battle of Drepana, but the victory is Pyrrhic. Carthage is running out of money to build new ships and pay mercenaries. Rome, despite terrible losses, can still mobilize its citizenry. In 241 BCE, a Roman fleet destroys the Carthaginian navy at the Battle of the Aegates Islands. Carthage sues for peace. The peace terms are harsh, but not catastrophic. Carthage surrenders Sicily, pays a substantial indemnity, and promises not to attack Rome's allies. But Carthage survives intact, still controlling its African territories, Spain, and Sardinia. It seems like a defeat from which Carthage can recover. Then disaster strikes from an unexpected direction. The mercenary army that Carthage has been using in Sicily, unpaid during the war's final years, returns to Africa demanding their wages. Carthage, financially exhausted, cannot pay them immediately. The mercenaries revolt. The mercenary war that follows from 241 to 237 BCE nearly destroys Carthage more completely than the Roman War. The mercenaries are joined by Libyan subjects who resent Carthaginian rule. Soon Carthage is besieged in its own capital, cut off from its agricultural hinterland, starving. The war becomes horrifically brutal, with both sides committing atrocities. Mercenary leaders crucify Carthaginian prisoners and send their severed heads and hands to the city. Carthaginian forces, when they finally gain the upper hand, crucify mercenary prisoners by the thousands. The man who saves Carthage is Hamilcar Barca, the finest general Carthage has produced in generations. He had fought brilliantly, but ultimately unsuccessfully in Sicily during the First Punic War. Now he uses guile, diplomacy, and ruthless military efficiency to divide the mercenary coalition and defeat it piecemeal. By 237 BCE, he has crushed the rebellion and stands as Carthage's most powerful citizen. But during the crisis, Rome had seized Carthage's islands of Sardinia and Corsica, claiming Carthage had violated the peace treaty. Carthage, fighting for survival, could do nothing. This betrayal burns in Carthaginian memory. Hamilcar Barca looks at Carthage's situation with clear eyes. The city has lost Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. It has been humiliated by Rome and nearly destroyed by its own mercenaries. It needs new sources of wealth and new armies loyal to Carthage rather than just to their paychecks. Hamilcar looks west, towards Spain. The Iberian Peninsula is rich in silver and minerals, its tribes fierce but divided. If Carthage can conquer Spain, it can rebuild its wealth and power. Hamilcar takes his family, including his young son Hannibal, to Spain. According to legend, before departing, he makes 9-year-old Hannibal swear eternal hatred of Rome. Whether this oath-taking actually occurred, the hatred certainly does. For 9 years, Hamilcar conquers and consolidates Carthaginian power in Spain. He establishes new cities, including Acroluce, modern Alicante. He mines Spanish silver to refill Carthage's treasury. He recruits and trains Spanish warriors, creating an army loyal to his family rather than to Carthage's merchant senate. When Hamilcar dies in battle in 228 BCE, his son-in-law Hasdrubal continues his work, founding the city of New Carthage, modern Cartagena, as the capital of Carthaginian Spain. When Hasdrubal is assassinated in 221 BCE, the army acclaims Hamilcar's son as their commander. At 26 years old, Hannibal Barca takes command of Carthaginian forces in Spain. The stage is set for the most famous military campaign in ancient history and the war that will nearly destroy both civilizations. Chapter 3. Hannibal's Oath. The young man who takes command of Carthage. The Spanish army in 221 BCE is already a legend among his soldiers. Hannibal Barca has spent his entire life preparing for this moment. Raised in military camps, trained in tactics by his father, and Spartan mercenaries educated in Greek language and culture by his tutor, socialist Hannibal combines Carthaginian commercial pragmatism with Greek strategic thinking and a personal vendetta against Rome that burns like a sacred fire. He's about to prove himself one of history's greatest military geniuses and one of its greatest tragic figures. For 2 years, Hannibal consolidates power in Spain, crushing rebellious tribes and demonstrating the combination of military brilliance and political acumen that characterizes his leadership. He treats defeated enemies with calculated mercy when it serves his purpose and ruthless severity when it doesn't. He shares hardships with his men, eating their food, sleeping on the ground wrapped in a common soldier's cloak. He leads from the front in battle, personally commanding cavalry charges. His soldiers worship him. The Carthaginian Senate, hundreds of miles away in North Africa, grows nervous about his growing power but cannot deny his effectiveness. Hannibal understands that another war with Rome is inevitable. The question isn't whether, but when and how. Rome has been expanding its power throughout Italy, and Roman merchants are increasingly active in Spain, threatening Carthaginian economic interests. The treaty ending the First Punic War established the Ebro River as the boundary between Roman and Carthaginian influence in Spain, but the city of Saguntum south of the Ebro has allied with Rome. In 219 BCE, Hannibal besieges Saguntum, calculating that Rome will either abandon its ally, revealing Roman promises as worthless, or will defend it, giving Hannibal his casus belli. Rome demands that Carthage hand over Hannibal for punishment. The Carthaginian Senate faces an impossible choice. Hannibal has made himself indispensable, and refusing Rome's demand means war. After furious debate, Carthage stands behind its general. Roman ambassadors sail to Carthage for final negotiations. In the Senate chamber, the lead Roman envoy, Quintus Fabius Maximus, makes a dramatic gesture. He gathers his toga as if holding something in its folds and declares, "Here I hold both peace and war. Which will you have?" The Carthaginian Suffete replies, "Whichever you please." Fabius responds, "Then we give you war." Thus begins the Second Punic War, the conflict that will bring Rome to the edge of extinction and seal Carthage's ultimate fate. Hannibal's plan is audacious to the point of madness. Rather than waiting for Rome to bring the war to Spain or Africa, he will invade Italy itself. He will march an army, including war elephants from Spain, through southern Gaul, over the Alps mountains Romans consider impassable to armies, and bring the war to Rome's heartland. There, he will defeat Roman armies, destroy Rome's system of Italian allies, and force Rome to terms. It's a plan that requires logistical genius, diplomatic skill, and military brilliance. Hannibal possesses all three. In the spring of 218 BCE, Hannibal departs New Carthage with approximately 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. He fights his way through hostile Spanish tribes, crosses the Pyrenees, and enters southern Gaul. Already his army has shrunk through combat and desertion. He negotiates with some Gallic tribes, fights others, and crosses the Rhine River before Romans even realize he isn't moving by sea. When news reaches Rome that Hannibal is marching toward the Alps, the Senate doesn't believe it. It's autumn. No one crosses the Alps with an army in autumn. The Alpine crossing becomes the stuff of legend. For 15 days, Hannibal's army struggles through mountain passes, fighting hostile mountain tribes, battling rock slides and avalanches, suffering from cold and starvation. Elephants, evolved for African plains, suffer terribly. When the army descends into the Po Valley, only about 26,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and a handful of elephants remain. 2/3 of Hannibal's force is gone. But those who survive are hardened veterans, bound together by shared ordeal and absolute faith in their commander. And now they stand in Italy, ready to show Rome what happens when you push Carthage too far. The Romans send armies to intercept this impossible invasion. At the Trebia River in December 218 BCE, Hannibal demonstrates the tactical genius that will terrorize Rome for 15 years. He lures the Roman army into attacking across an icy river, exhausting them, then springs a trap using cavalry and hidden infantry. The Romans are destroyed, losing perhaps 20,000 men. Rome is shocked but not deterred. They raise new armies. In the spring of 217 BCE, Hannibal marched south, ravaging the countryside, trying to force Rome's Italian allies to defect. The consul Gaius Flaminius pursues him with an army of 30,000 men, eager to restore Roman honor. Hannibal leads Flaminius's army into a trap on the shores of Lake Trasimene. In the morning mist, Hannibal's forces attack from ambush. The battle is a massacre. Flaminius dies in combat, and his army is annihilated in 3 hours of slaughter. Some 15,000 Romans die, and another 15,000 are captured. Rome has lost 2 armies and 2 consuls in less than 6 months. Panic grips Rome. Hannibal is loose in Italy, seemingly invincible. The Senate appoints Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator. Fabius understands that Rome cannot defeat Hannibal in open battle, so he implements a strategy of avoiding confrontation, shadowing Hannibal's army, cutting his supply lines, and attacking his foragers. It's effective, but politically unpopular. Romans want glory, not guerrilla warfare. They derisively call Fabius Cunctator, the delayer. But Fabius is buying time, and time is something Rome has more of than Hannibal. By 216 BCE, Roman patience with Fabian's strategy is exhausted. They elect two consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, and give them Rome's largest army ever assembled, approximately 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. Their orders are simple: find Hannibal and destroy him. They find him at Cannae in southern Italy. Hannibal has about 50,000 men. The Romans are supremely confident. They outnumber the Carthaginians, and this time they will crush this African upstart who has humiliated Rome for 2 years. On August 2nd, 216 BCE, the armies meet at Cannae. What happens next enters military history as perhaps the most perfect tactical victory ever achieved. Hannibal arranges his infantry in a convex formation, with his best troops on the wings and his weakest in the center. The Romans form their traditional dense formation and attack the center. Hannibal's center gives ground, slowly, deliberately, drawing the Romans deeper into a pocket. The Roman army packs tighter together, each man pressing forward. And then Hannibal springs the trap. His cavalry, having routed the Roman cavalry, attacks the Roman rear. His infantry wings, commanded by his brother Mago and his nephew Hasdrubal, wheel inward, enclosing the Roman flanks. The Roman army is surrounded, packed so tightly men cannot raise their weapons. The slaughter continues from morning into afternoon. By day's end, perhaps 50,000 to 70,000 Romans and Italian allies lie dead on the field of Cannae. The consul Paulus dies in combat. The consul Varro escapes with barely 10,000 survivors. It is the worst defeat in Roman military history. Hannibal sends messengers to Carthage with news of the victory and several bushels of gold rings taken from the fingers of dead Roman senators and equestrians. In Carthage, there is jubilation but also hesitation. The war party, led by the Barcid faction, argues for sending massive reinforcements to Hannibal so he can march on Rome itself and end the war. The peace party, led by Hanno the Great, argues that Hannibal is too dangerous, too powerful, too independent. They send modest reinforcements, inadequate for completing the conquest. It is a fatal miscalculation. Hannibal will spend 13 more years in Italy, winning battle after battle, but never receiving the resources needed to actually conquer Rome. Rome, devastated but not defeated, does something extraordinary. They refuse to surrender. They free slaves to fight. They raise new armies from boys and old men. They implement Fabian tactics, avoiding battle while slowly, methodically reconquering the Italian cities that defected to Hannibal. Most importantly, they refuse to acknowledge that they have lost. This Roman characteristic, the absolute refusal to accept defeat no matter the cost, will ultimately triumph. But that triumph is still 14 years away, and Hannibal remains in Italy undefeated, carrying the hopes of Carthage and the hatred of generations on his shoulders. Chapter 4. The Long War after Cannae. Hannibal faces a strategic dilemma that will define the rest of his Italian campaign. His Numidian cavalry commander, Maharbal, urges him to march immediately on Rome. In 5 days, you shall feast as victor in the capital. You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one. Whether Maharbal actually says these words or Roman historians invent them later, the question haunts history. Why doesn't Hannibal march on Rome immediately after his greatest victory? The answer reveals the reality of ancient warfare that dramatic battle accounts often obscure. Hannibal's army, though victorious, is exhausted and has no siege equipment. Rome's walls are formidable, and the city itself still contains tens of thousands of troops. Hannibal's strategy has never been to conquer Rome through siege. He has neither the numbers nor the equipment for that. Instead, he aims to break Rome's confederation of Italian allies, isolating Rome until it must accept peace terms. After Cannae, this strategy seems to be working. Several crucial Italian cities, including Capua, the second largest city in Italy, defect to Hannibal. The king of Macedon, Philip V, allies with Carthage, forcing Rome to fight on multiple fronts. Syracuse in Sicily, breaks its alliance with Rome. For the next 13 years, Hannibal campaigns throughout southern Italy, demonstrating military brilliance that keeps multiple Roman armies at bay while trying to expand his coalition of Italian allies. He establishes his headquarters at Capua, where his army spends the winter of 216 to 215 BCE. Roman historians later claimed that the luxury of Capua softened Hannibal's troops, that the great Carthaginian army was corrupted by Italian comfort. This is propaganda. Hannibal's forces remain formidable. The problem is that Rome refuses to fight the kind of war Hannibal needs to win. Rome implements what history will call the Fabian strategy, named after Fabius Maximus, who pioneered it. Multiple Roman armies shadow Hannibal, avoiding decisive battle, cutting his supply lines, and methodically besieging and reconquering the Italian cities that have defected to Carthage. When Hannibal moves to help an allied city, the Romans simply withdraw. When he leaves, they return. It's frustrating, unglamorous warfare, but it's effective. Hannibal wins every battle he fights, but he cannot be everywhere at once, and gradually his coalition fragments. The war expands throughout the Mediterranean. In Spain, Hannibal's brothers Hasdrubal and Mago fight to hold Carthaginian territories against Roman legions. In Sicily, Rome besieges Syracuse, which has defected to Carthage. The siege becomes famous because Syracuse is defended by the brilliant inventor Archimedes, who creates ingenious war machines, including cranes that lift Roman ships from the water and, according to legend, mirrors that focus sunlight to burn Roman vessels. When Syracuse falls in 212 BC, after a 2-year siege, a Roman soldier kills Archimedes despite orders to capture him alive. It's a small tragedy within the larger war, but it illustrates how this conflict consumes everything in its path. The tide begins to turn in 211 BC. Rome besieges Capua, Hannibal's Italian headquarters. Hannibal attempts a brilliant strategic maneuver. He marches on Rome itself, hoping to panic the Romans into abandoning the siege of Capua. Roman legend claims that as Hannibal's army appears before Rome's walls, the land where his camp stands is being auctioned in Rome's form and sells for its full price, indicating Roman confidence that Hannibal will fail. Whether this story is true, Rome's armies don't break off the siege of Capua. Hannibal cannot take Rome without siege equipment. So after a few days demonstrating before the walls, he withdraws. Capua falls shortly after. The Capuans who supported Hannibal face brutal Roman retribution. Their leaders are tortured and executed, the populace enslaved or dispossessed. In Spain, disaster strikes the Carthaginian cause. In 211 BCE, the Roman general Publius Cornelius Scipio and his brother Gnaeus are killed in separate battles. It seems like a Carthaginian victory, but Rome sends Publius's son, also named Publius Cornelius Scipio, to take command. This young Scipio is only 25 years old, technically too young for the command, but he is appointed proconsul and given unprecedented authority. Young Scipio is a military prodigy who has studied Hannibal's tactics carefully. In 209 BCE, he captures New Carthage, the Carthaginian capital in Spain, in a brilliant assault that combines tactical surprise with strategic daring. Spain begins to slip from Carthaginian control. Hannibal, still in Italy, desperately needs reinforcements. His brother Hasdrubal, after losing Spain, marched with a new army from Spain across the Alps, intending to join Hannibal in Italy and finally achieve the numerical superiority needed to crush Rome. It's a brilliant plan. Two Carthaginian armies, commanded by the era's finest generals, operating in Italy, could potentially force Rome to terms. But Roman intelligence intercepts Hasdrubal's messengers. The consul Gaius Claudius Nero, shadowing Hannibal in southern Italy, makes a bold decision. He takes a portion of his army and marches north at forced pace, secretly reinforcing the other consul's army that is facing Hasdrubal. At the Battle of Metaurus in 207 BCE, the Romans destroy Hasdrubal's army. Hasdrubal himself dies fighting. The Romans send Nero back south with a ghastly message for Hannibal. Hasdrubal's severed head is thrown into Hannibal's camp. When Hannibal sees his brother's head, he understands that the war in Italy is lost. He reportedly says, "I see there the fate of Carthage." He retreats to the toe of Italy, fighting defensive actions, maintaining his undefeated army, but no longer able to threaten Rome. For 4 more years, he holds his position, hoping for reinforcements or political changes that never come. Meanwhile, young Scipio has conquered Spain and conceives a bold strategy. Rather than pursuing Hannibal in Italy, he proposes invading North Africa itself, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal to defend the homeland. It's the same strategy Carthage used against Rome's African invasion during the First Punic War. But this time, Rome has a general capable of implementing it. In 204 BCE, Scipio lands in Africa with an army of about 25,000 men. He allies with the Numidian king Massinissa, whose cavalry provides the mobile force Scipio needs. Scipio defeats several Carthaginian armies, demonstrates military brilliance equal to Hannibal's, and marches toward Carthage itself. In Carthage, panic sets in. The city that has relied on Hannibal's army in Italy for 15 years suddenly faces Roman legions at its gates. The Carthaginian Senate sends frantic messages to Hannibal, "Return and save the homeland." In 203 BCE, after 15 years in Italy, 15 years undefeated on Italian soil, Hannibal boards ships with the remnants of his army. Roman historians claim that as his ship leaves Italy, Hannibal curses the land that has been his home for so long, curses Rome, and curses the Carthaginian Senate that failed to support him. He returns to Africa knowing that everything he has accomplished, all the battles won, all the years of brilliant campaigning, may be meaningless if he cannot defeat Scipio in the coming confrontation. Chapter 5. Zama, the meeting between Hannibal Barca and Publius Cornelius. Scipio before the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE is one of history's most dramatic moments. The two greatest generals of their age, meeting face to face before the battle that will determine whether Carthage survives as an independent power. Ancient historians, particularly Livy and Polybius, record that the two commanders meet privately to discuss peace terms. Whether this meeting actually occurs or is later invention, the symbolic power is undeniable. The old lion of Carthage, undefeated in tactical combat, but worn by impossible strategic circumstances, facing the young Roman prodigy who has studied every one of Hannibal's victories to learn how to defeat him. Hannibal proposes terms. Carthage will withdraw from all disputed territories, including Spain and the Mediterranean islands, but will retain its African empire and independence. Scipio refuses. Rome has spent 17 years fighting this war, has lost hundreds of thousands of men, has been brought to the edge of destruction. Now, with victory in sight, there will be no compromise. Carthage must surrender unconditionally or fight. The two generals return to their armies. Tomorrow, everything will be decided. The armies that face each other at Zama are surprisingly similar in size, each around 40,000 men, but their composition reveals how the war has transformed both powers. Hannibal's army is a polyglot force of Carthaginian citizens, Libyan infantry, Bruttian Italians who have remained loyal to him, and Ligurian mercenaries. He has approximately 80 war elephants, more than he's ever commanded in Italy. But he lacks the veteran troops who followed him across the Alps and through 15 years of Italian campaigning. Those soldiers are mostly dead or too old to fight. These are new recruits, untested, facing the finest army Rome has ever fielded. Scipio's legions are veteran soldiers who have conquered Spain and defeated every Carthaginian army sent against them in Africa. More importantly, Scipio has secured the alliance of King Massinissa of Numidia, who brings thousands of expert Numidian cavalry. These are the same light horsemen who gave Hannibal his tactical advantage throughout the Italian campaign. Now, they fight for Rome. Hannibal, seeing Massinissa's cavalry on the Roman side, understands how completely circumstances have changed. The weapon he used to dominate Rome for 15 years is continue now wielded against him. Hannibal arrays his forces in an unusual formation. He places his war elephants in front, hoping they will disrupt the Roman formation. Behind them, he positions his mercenary and auxiliary troops in the first line expendable forces, meant to absorb the initial Roman assault and tire the legions. His second line consists of Carthaginian and Libyan infantry, and his third line, held well back from the others, comprises his Italian veterans from the long campaign. It's a defensive formation, designed to blunt Roman attacks through depth, and it reveals something painful. Hannibal doesn't trust his army to execute the complex maneuvers that won him Cannae and Trebia. He has elephants in numbers, but he lacks the cohesion and training of his legendary army. Scipio, who has studied Hannibal's tactics obsessively, understands that traditional Roman formations will be vulnerable to the elephants and to Hannibal's likely envelopment tactics. He adapts. Instead of the usual checkerboard formation of maniples, he arranges his legions in columns with lanes between them. When the elephants charge, the Roman troops will open the lanes wider, and trumpets and javelins will drive the elephants through the gaps or turn them back into Carthaginian lines. It's innovative, flexible, exactly the kind of tactical creativity that has made Scipio dangerous. The battle begins with the elephant charge. 80 massive beasts thunder toward the Roman lines, and for a moment, it seems they might break the legions through sheer terror. But Scipio's preparation pays off. Roman trumpeters blow harsh blasts. Legionaries bang their swords against their shields, creating cacophony. Javelins rain on the elephants. The beasts panic. Some stampede through the lanes in the Roman formation, causing minimal damage. Others turn back into their own lines, trampling Carthaginian cavalry. Hannibal's opening gambit fails. The infantry clash begins. Hannibal's first line advances, meeting Scipio's hastati, the youngest Roman soldiers forming the front rank. The fighting is brutal, close-quarters butchery with swords and spears. Hannibal's mercenaries fight well but begin to give ground under Roman pressure. The second Roman line, the Principes, moves forward to reinforce. Hannibal's first line breaks and flees backward. But here Hannibal has prepared a ruthless contingency. His second line doesn't open ranks to let the retreating mercenaries through. Instead, they hold formation, forcing the fleeing troops to scatter around the flanks. Some mercenaries, enraged at being abandoned, actually turn and fight against their Carthaginian employers. It's a cold-blooded decision, but it allows Hannibal's second line to meet fresh Roman troops with unbroken formations. The second phase of the battle bogs down into grinding attrition. Carthaginian and Libyan infantry fight with desperate courage, knowing that defeat means the end of their civilization. Roman legionaries push forward with the methodical brutality that has conquered Italy. Men die by the thousands in the narrow space between the armies. The dead pile so high that soldiers must climb over corpses to reach their enemies. For hours, the lines surge back and forth without either side gaining decisive advantage. Hannibal still holds his third line, his Italian veterans, in reserve, hundreds of yards behind the main combat. It's the traditional reserve position, but the distance becomes fatal. When Hannibal's second line finally breaks under Roman pressure, there's too much space for the Roman lines to reform before engaging Hannibal's best troops. Scipio calls forward his triarii, the oldest, most veteran Roman troops, and forms a single, massive battle line. Hannibal's veterans form their own line. Two walls of experienced soldiers, the best troops of both armies, face each other across a field littered with the dead. But before the infantry can clash decisively, the battle's outcome is determined on the wings. Throughout the infantry combat, cavalry battles have raged on both flanks. Hannibal's cavalry, outnumbered and outclassed by Maecenas' Numidians and Roman horsemen, has been driven from the field. Scipio's cavalry commanders, following pre-battle instructions, don't pursue the fleeing Carthaginian horsemen far. Instead, they wheel back toward the battlefield. As Hannibal's veterans prepare to sell their lives dearly, Roman and Numidian cavalry crash into their rear and flanks. It's canny in reverse. The same double envelopment that Hannibal perfected, now executed against him. The same crushing psychological and physical impact of being surrounded, now felt by Carthaginian soldiers. The same methodical slaughter, now inflicted on the army that invented the tactic. Hannibal's veterans fight with courage born of desperation, but they are surrounded, outnumbered, and doomed. Thousands die where they stand, refusing to surrender. Hannibal, seeing his army disintegrating around him, does something he has never done in his career. He flees the battlefield. It's not cowardice. If Hannibal dies at Zama, Carthage has no one to negotiate peace, no military authority to restrain the army, no leader to prevent complete catastrophe. He escapes with a small group of cavalry, leaving behind perhaps 20,000 dead Carthaginians and allies. Another 15,000 are captured. Rome loses about 1,500 men. It's not as lopsided as Cannae, but it's decisive enough. Hannibal rides to Hadrumetum, a coastal city south of Carthage, and from there sends messages to the Carthaginian Senate. His message is stark. The war is lost. Carthage must accept whatever terms Rome offers. There is no army left to defend the city, no allies to call upon, no strategy that can salvage victory from this defeat. After 17 years of war, after victories that destroyed 5 Roman armies, after accomplishments that will be studied by military commanders for millennia, Hannibal admits defeat. In Carthage, the Senate receives Hannibal's message with a mixture of grief, rage, and panic. Some senators blame Hannibal. If only he had received more support. If only he had marched on Rome after Cannae. If only he had won at Zama. But these are the recriminations of the defeated. The reality is that Carthage has gambled its existence on destroying Rome and has failed. Now they must face the consequences. Carthage sends ambassadors to Scipio's camp to negotiate. The terms are harsh. Carthage must surrender all territories outside Africa. The navy must be reduced to 10 ships, a death sentence for a maritime power. Carthage must pay a massive indemnity of 10,000 talents over 50 years. Most humiliatingly, Carthage cannot make war on anyone, even in self-defense, without Roman permission. Carthage is to become a client state, independent in name but subservient to Rome in fact. The Carthaginian Senate debates whether to accept. Some argue for fighting to the end. Better to die free than live enslaved. But Hannibal himself addresses the Senate and argues for acceptance. He has spent his life fighting Rome, has sworn eternal hatred, has sacrificed everything to destroy the Roman threat. But he is also a realist. Carthage cannot win. The choice is between harsh peace and complete annihilation. The Senate accepts the terms. In 201 BCE, 17 years after it began, the Second Punic War ends. Carthage survives, but as a shadow of its former power. The vast empire is gone, the mighty navy destroyed, the city's future controlled by Rome. Hannibal, the undefeated general who brought Rome to its knees, has lost the only battle that mattered. He will spend the rest of his life in exile, hunted by Rome, dying by his own hand in a foreign land rather than be captured. But before that end comes, he will try one more time to save Carthage from itself, to reform the corrupt oligarchy that failed to support his war effort. It's his final campaign, and like all his efforts, it will be brilliant, controversial, and ultimately futile. Chapter 6. Hannibal's final campaign. The Hannibal who returns to Carthage in 200 BCE is 46 years old, scarred by combat and worn by decades of impossible campaigning. He has spent 36 of his 46 years either preparing for war or fighting it. Now he faces his most dangerous enemy yet. Not Romans on a battlefield, but Carthaginian oligarchs in the Senate chamber. The man who terrified Rome for nearly 2 decades is about to discover that reforming Carthage from within might be harder than conquering Italy. Carthage, in the immediate aftermath of the war, is a city of contradictions. Despite the devastating defeat and the crushing terms of the peace treaty, the city itself remains wealthy. The North African territories are intact and productive. Trade continues, though diminished. The problem isn't poverty. It's corruption and financial mismanagement so profound that Carthage struggles to make the indemnity payments to Rome, despite having the resources to do so. The merchant oligarchs who control the Senate have spent decades enriching themselves at the state's expense, and they aren't about to stop now. Hannibal's first move is to secure political power. Despite his failure at Zama, he remains immensely popular with common citizens and with the army. In 196 BCE, he is elected as one of Carthage's 2 suffetes, the equivalent of a consul. It's an unusual choice. Suffetes traditionally come from established merchant families and focus on civilian administration. Hannibal is military nobility, a general with no experience in domestic governance. But circumstances are unusual, and the people want someone who can restore Carthaginian greatness, or at least prevent further decline. What Hannibal discovers when he begins examining Carthage's finances horrifies him. The city should easily be able to afford the Roman indemnity payments. The North African territories produce enormous agricultural wealth. Trade, though reduced, remains profitable. Yet the treasury is nearly empty, and the oligarchs keep proposing new taxes on common citizens to fund the indemnity payments. Hannibal investigates and uncovers systematic embezzlement. A small group of wealthy merchants, including members of the Council of 104 judges who oversee public spending, have been diverting public funds into their private accounts for decades. Hannibal proposes sweeping reforms. He wants to replace the oligarchic council with a system where judges serve limited terms rather than life appointments, ending the entrenched corruption. He proposes a comprehensive audit of public finances to recover stolen funds. He advocates reforming the tax system to make wealthy merchants pay their fair share rather than placing the burden on small farmers and laborers. Most radically, he suggests that Carthage could pay the Roman indemnity without additional taxes if corruption is eliminated. It's a direct attack on the merchant elite who control Carthage. The oligarchs fight back viciously. They cannot attack Hannibal's military reputation. He remains a hero to the masses. Instead, they attack his character, claiming he has stolen gold himself during the Italian campaign. They argue his reforms will destabilize the government during a precarious time. They whisper that Hannibal harbors ambitions to make himself tyrant of Carthage. Most dangerously, they send secret messages to Rome, informing the Senate that Hannibal is plotting with Antiochus III, the Seleucid king, to launch another war against Rome. Whether Hannibal actually corresponds with Antiochus is unclear. He certainly hates Rome and might welcome another chance to fight them. But the accusations give Rome the pretext it needs. In 195 BCE, Roman ambassadors arrive in Carthage, demanding that Hannibal be handed over at the face trial for violating the peace treaty. Hannibal understands immediately that this is the oligarchs' doing. They have sold him to Rome to preserve their corrupt system. Hannibal faces a choice: surrender to Rome and face certain execution, or flee into exile. His entire life has been defined by struggle against Rome, by refusing to submit, by choosing the hard path over the easy one. Now, at 51 years old, he chooses it again. Under cover of darkness, Hannibal slips out of Carthage and rides east toward the coast. From there, he boards a ship to Tyre, the ancient Phoenician city from which Carthage's founders came centuries ago. It's a poignant journey, the greatest Carthaginian general fleeing to the old homeland his ancestors left 800 years before. From Tyre, Hannibal travels to Antioch, the capital of the Seleucid Empire. King Antiochus III welcomes him enthusiastically. The Seleucid Empire is preparing for war with Rome over control of Greece, and having Hannibal, the only general who has ever truly defeated Rome, as an advisor seems like a tremendous advantage. Antiochus gives Hannibal honors, titles, and a seat on the war council. But Hannibal quickly discovers that Antiochus is no true ally. The Seleucid king treats Hannibal as a trophy, a famous name to impress other rulers, but rarely takes his advice seriously. When Hannibal proposes strategy for the Roman war invasion of Italy, naval attacks on Rome's grain supply, alliance with Macedon, Antiochus dismisses the plans as too ambitious. The king prefers to fight a limited war in Greece, believing Rome will accept a negotiated settlement. Hannibal warns that Rome never accepts negotiated settlements when it believes it can win. Rome doesn't fight for limited objectives, it fights for total victory. His warnings are ignored. In 191 BCE, Roman legions under Manius Acilius Glabriu crush Antiochus's army at Thermopylae. In 190 BCE, Scipio Africanus's brother, Lucius Cornelius Scipio, defeats Antiochus decisively at the Battle of Magnesia. The Seleucid Empire sues for peace on harsh Roman terms. One of those terms is the surrender of Hannibal. Once again, Hannibal flees. He is 57 years old now, his health failing, but he refuses to give Rome the satisfaction of capture. He travels to Crete, then to Bithynia in northern Asia Minor, where King Prusias employs him as a military advisor. For several years, Hannibal helps Prusias fight local wars against neighboring kingdoms. He designs fortifications, advises on naval tactics, and even commands ships in minor engagements. It's a pale shadow of his former glory, but Hannibal remains active, his strategic mind still sharp. In 183 BCE, Roman ambassadors arrive in Bithynia. They demand that Prusias hand over Hannibal. The king, terrified of Roman power, agrees. Roman soldiers surround Hannibal's residence on the Bithynian coast. Hannibal, now 64 years old, has prepared for this moment. He carries poison hidden in a ring for this eventuality. As Roman soldiers batter at his doors, Hannibal takes the poison. His last words, recorded by various ancient historians, are variations on a theme. Let us relieve the Romans of their anxiety. They are too impatient to wait for an old man to die. Hannibal Barca dies in exile, far from Carthage, never seeing his homeland again after his flight 20 years earlier. Rome's greatest enemy, the man who killed more Roman soldiers than any other commander in history, ends his life not in glorious battle, but in a shabby house in a foreign land, hunted to his death by the power he dedicated his life to destroying. It's a tragic end to a tragic life. Brilliant, brave, doomed by circumstances beyond his control and by his own inability to compromise his principles. News of Hannibal's death reaches Rome and Carthage almost simultaneously. In Rome, there is celebration tinged with relief. Some Romans, particularly older senators who remember the terror of Cannae and Trebia, have never stopped fearing that Hannibal might somehow return. His death finally closes that chapter. But some Romans, including perhaps Scipio Africanus himself, recognize the tragedy that Rome's greatest antagonist was also worthy of respect, a genius destroyed by the very conflict he had been raised from birth. In Carthage, reactions are mixed. Some citizens mourn Hannibal as a hero, the greatest general their civilization ever produced, betrayed by corrupt oligarchs. Others blame him for the catastrophic war that cost Carthage its empire. The merchant oligarchs who forced his exile feel vindicated. Hannibal was a dangerous radical who threatened their profits and privileges. They returned to business as usual, extracting wealth from North Africa, making their indemnity payments to Rome, and imagining that they can preserve Carthaginian independence through accommodation and commerce. They are wrong. Hannibal understood something the merchant oligarchs never grasp. Rome doesn't want Carthaginian tribute or Carthaginian subordination. Rome wants Carthage destroyed. For the next 37 years after Hannibal's death, Carthage exists on borrowed time, a prosperous but powerless city-state clinging to the illusion of independence. In Rome, a senator named Marcus Porcius Cato ends every speech, regardless of topic, with the same phrase: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. One day, Rome will listen to him. Chapter 7. The wounds that never heal. In the decades following Hannibal's death, Carthage experiences something unexpected: prosperity. Without the burden of maintaining armies and fleets, without the expense of imperial administration, the city focuses entirely on commerce and agriculture. The North African territories boom. Carthage exports grain, olive oil, wine, and manufactured goods throughout the Mediterranean. Ships bearing Carthaginian goods appear in every major port. The indemnity payments to Rome, once thought crushing, are paid early. By 151 BCE, 50 years after Zama, Carthage has completely satisfied its war debt. This resurgence alarms Rome. Romans had expected Carthage to slowly decline into poverty and irrelevance after its defeat. Instead, the city thrives. Roman merchants complain about Carthaginian competition. In the Roman Senate, influential voices begin arguing that Carthage poses an economic threat even without military power. The merchant oligarchs of Carthage, believing they have successfully accommodated Roman supremacy, fail to recognize how deeply Roman anxiety runs. The voice of that anxiety belongs to Marcus Porcius Cato, known as Cato the Elder or Cato the Censor. Born in 234 BCE, Cato fought against Carthage in Spain and Africa during the Second Punic War. He is now 83 years old, a senior statesman whose opinions carry enormous weight. Cato has developed an obsession with Carthage that borders on paranoia. He genuinely believes that as long as Carthage exists, Rome remains in danger. He doesn't care that Carthage has no fleet beyond coastal patrol boats, no army beyond a city guard, no territories beyond North Africa. He sees Carthaginian commercial success and imagines future military threats. In 153 BCE, Cato leads a senatorial delegation to Carthage to mediate a border dispute between Carthage and Numidia. The dispute itself is minor King Massinissa of Numidia, Rome's ally since Zoma, has been gradually encroaching on Carthaginian territory for decades, and Carthage wants Roman arbitration. But the visit's impact exceeds the diplomatic mission. Cato walks through Carthage's streets, sees the bustling markets, the reconstructed buildings, the signs of wealth. He visits the harbors and sees merchant ships by the hundreds. Most alarmingly, he sees that Carthage's population has recovered. Perhaps 400,000 people live in the city, making it nearly as large as Rome. When Cato returns to Rome, he carries with him a ripe fig. Standing before the Senate, he holds up the fruit and announces that it was picked in Carthage just 3 days ago. His point is clear. Carthage is so close to Rome that fresh fruit can make the journey in days. A city that prosperous, that close, that connected, that populous, could rebuild its military power quickly if it chose to. He begins ending every speech, regardless of topic, with his famous phrase, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Not all Roman senators agree. Publius Cornelius Scipio Nazica, grandson of the great Scipio Africanus, argues against Cato's position. Scipio Nazica believes that Rome needs Carthage as a cautionary presence, that having a former enemy nearby, weakened but not destroyed, keeps Rome focused and disciplined. He fears that without any external threat, Roman society will become complacent and corrupt. He counters Cato says Carthago delenda est with his own formula, Carthago servanda est. Carthage must be preserved. This debate reveals deeper anxieties within Roman society. Rome has been continuously at war for over a century. War is the framework through which Roman aristocrats achieve glory. Common citizens gain wealth through plunder, and the state expands its power. But now Rome dominates the Mediterranean so completely that major wars become rare. Spain is pacified, Macedon defeated, the Greek cities controlled, Carthage neutered. Some Romans wonder, without war, what is Rome's purpose? Cato's obsession with Carthage stems partly from this anxiety. Destroying Carthage would give Rome one more grand purpose, one more unifying mission. The crisis that seals Carthage's fate begins with Massinissa of Numidia. Now over 90 years old, the Numidian king has spent 50 years gradually expanding his territory at Carthaginian expense, taking a village here, a region there, always claiming the land historically belonged to Numidia. Under the treaty terms, Carthage cannot make war without Roman permission, even in self-defense. Every time Carthage appeals to Rome for arbitration, Roman commissioners inevitably rule in Massinissa's favor or declare the matter ambiguous. It's systematic harassment, designed to provoke Carthage into either accepting gradual dismemberment or fighting back. By 151 BCE, Carthaginian patience reaches its breaking point. A war party gains influence in the Senate, arguing that treaty terms requiring Roman permission for self-defense are intolerable. They point out that Carthage has fully paid its indemnity technically. The treaty's obligation is fulfilled. When Massinissa seizes more territory, Carthage assembles an army and marches to expel the Numidians. It's a catastrophic mistake. The Carthaginian army, untrained and poorly led after 50 years of enforced peace, is crushed by Massinissa's veteran warriors. Thousands of Carthaginians die, and survivors flee back to the city. Rome has its casus belli. Carthage has raised an army and made war without Roman permission. The Senate declares Carthage in violation of the peace treaty. The penalty will be war. Both consuls for 149 BCE, Manius Manilius and Lucius Marcius Censorinus, receive command of armies and orders to invade Africa. Carthage, understanding the catastrophe about to descend, sends ambassadors to Rome promising full compliance with any Roman demands. The Carthaginian ambassadors arrive in Rome prepared to offer anything to avoid war. They prostrate themselves before the Senate, acknowledging Carthage's violation of the treaty, promising never to repeat the mistake. The Senate responds with its first demand. Carthage must hand over 300 hostages from aristocratic families as guarantee of good behavior. It's harsh, but not unprecedented. Carthage agrees immediately. 300 young men and women from Carthage's noblest families board ships for Rome, not knowing they will never see their homeland again. Roman armies land in Africa near Utica, north of Carthage. The consuls summon Carthaginian ambassadors and deliver the second demand. Carthage must surrender all weapons and armor. Every sword, spear, helmet, shield, and piece of military equipment must be turned over to Rome. The Carthaginians are stunned. Disarming completely makes them helpless against Numidian raids, against pirates, against any threat. But resistance means immediate war with Rome, and Carthage has no army capable of resisting Roman legions. The Carthaginian Senate debates desperately and concludes they have no choice. If Rome wants weapons, Carthage will hand them over and manufacture new ones if needed. What follows is one of history's most remarkable demonstrations of compliance. For weeks, wagons roll from Carthage to the Roman camp carrying weapons. The quantities staggered the Romans: 200,000 sets of armor, 2,000 catapults, countless swords, spears, and shields. Carthage, which was supposed to have no military capacity, has apparently been stockpiling weapons for decades, perhaps hoping for a chance to rebuild power or simply as insurance against catastrophe. Now it all goes to Rome. The Carthaginians strip themselves bare, believing that compliance will save them. Once Carthage has been completely disarmed, the consuls summon ambassadors one final time and deliver the third demand. the one they have been building toward all along. The consuls declared that Carthage must be completely abandoned. The population will be permitted to live, to continue commerce, to govern themselves according to their own laws, but they must leave their city and relocate to a new site at least 10 miles inland from the sea. The ancient city of Carthage, with its magnificent harbors, its fortifications, its temples, its 800 years of history, must be evacuated and demolished. For a maritime people, this is a death sentence. Carthage's wealth depends entirely on sea trade. A city 10 miles inland cannot maintain a commercial fleet, cannot access the maritime trade networks that have sustained Carthage for centuries. The consuls understand this perfectly, so do the Carthaginian ambassadors. Rome isn't offering survival, it's offering slow extinction disguised as mercy. The ambassadors return to Carthage with the devastating news. In Carthage, the reaction is immediate and volcanic. The Senate that has counseled accommodation, that handed over hostages and weapons, that has tried desperately to appease Rome, is torn apart by a raging mob. Senators who argued for compliance are lynched in the streets. The Italian merchants who served as Rome's representatives in the city are tortured and murdered. The carefully constructed policy of accommodation, maintained for 50 years since Zama, collapses in hours. If Rome intends to destroy Carthage regardless of compliance, then Carthage will fight. They have nothing left to lose. Chapter 8. Carthage stands alone. The Carthage that chooses to resist Rome in 149 BCE is utterly unprepared for war. The city has just handed over every weapon, every piece of armor, every military implement to the Romans. There is no army, no trained soldiers, no military leadership. The citizen assembly, meeting in emergency session, understands that resistance might be futile, but submission means certain death. Carthage will fight, and if it must die, it will die on its feet. What follows is one of history's most extraordinary examples of desperate improvisation. The Carthaginians turn their entire city into a weapons factory. Every public building becomes an armory. Temples are repurposed as forges. Citizens melt down bronze statues and gold decorations to make spearheads and armor. Women cut their hair and braid it into bowstrings for catapults. Historians record that Carthaginian women donate their hair by the ton for this purpose. Enslaved people are freed and armed. Every man capable of holding a weapon is enrolled in militia units. Within weeks, Carthage manages to arm approximately 20,000 men. Though calling them soldiers is generous. They're mostly merchants, artisans, and farmers with makeshift equipment and minimal training. The Carthaginians elect Hasdrubal, a grandson of Massinissa, as military commander, not the city's first choice, but one of the few men with any military experience. A second Hasdrubal, a different man commanding forces outside the city, manages to raise another 20,000 troops from the Libyan countryside. These armies are pathetically inadequate against Roman legions, but they're better than nothing. The city's fortifications become its main hope. Carthage's walls stand 30 feet high in most places, 60 feet at the highest points, with towers rising another 40 feet. The walls stretch for 23 miles around the city and surrounding suburbs. If Carthage can hold behind these walls, perhaps Rome will tire of the siege. Perhaps political changes in Rome will bring peace. Perhaps something, anything, will save them. The Roman consuls, commanding approximately 80,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, confidently expect that Carthage will surrender once they begin the siege. The city is trapped on its peninsula, cut off from resupply, filled with civilians including women and children. Surely this desperate resistance will collapse quickly. The Romans established siege lines across the narrow isthmus connecting Carthage to the mainland, cutting off land access. Roman ships blockade the harbors. Consul Manilius leads assaults against the walls, while Consul Censorinus orders the construction of siege engines. The Carthaginians fight with ferocity born of desperation. When Romans attacked the walls, defenders rain down stones, boiling oil, and anything else they can throw. They sally out at night in small raids, targeting Roman siege equipment and supply dumps. The fighting is brutal, personal, and unforgiving. Neither side shows mercy because none is expected. The siege drags on through 149 BCE and into 148 BCE. The consuls, expecting quick victory, find themselves bogged down against an enemy who refuses to quit. Internal politics complicate Rome's campaign. The consuls quarrel over strategy and compete for glory. Manilius launches a poorly planned overland expedition to attack Carthaginian forces outside the city and suffers an embarrassing defeat. Censorinus, attempting to assault the naval harbor, loses siege engines to Carthaginian counterattacks. Back in Rome, critics question why the legions that conquered Macedon and Syria cannot subdue one North African city. After a year of siege warfare with minimal progress, both consuls are recalled. New commanders arrive, achieving no better results. In 147 BCE, Roman politics produced the man who will finally end the siege. Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, adoptive grandson of Scipio Africanus and biological son of Aemilius Paulus, the general who defeated Macedon, is elected consul despite being technically too young for the office. The Roman people, frustrated by the war's length, turn to the Scipio name, hoping that the grandson can finish what the grandfather started at Zama. Scipio Aemilianus is given command of the African campaign with extraordinary powers. Scipio arrives at Carthage and immediately imposes discipline. He finds the Roman army demoralized, disorganized, and infested with camp followers and merchants. He expels all non-combatants, institutes rigorous training, and courts-martial incompetent officers. Within weeks, he transforms the besieging force from a mob into an army. Then he tightens the noose around Carthage. He constructs a massive siege mole across the entrance to the naval harbor, blocking the last route for supply ships. He builds fortifications completely encircling the city, ensuring nothing enters or leaves. Carthage is now under total blockade. The Carthaginians respond with one final demonstration of desperate ingenuity. Trapped in their circular naval harbor by Scipio's mole, with no way to break the blockade, Carthaginian engineers secretly excavate a new channel to the sea from a different part of the harbor. They build 50 new warships using whatever materials they can salvage: wood from demolished buildings, bronze from temple fixtures, sailcloth from repurposed fabrics. When the new channel is complete, the Carthaginian fleet emerges unexpectedly, sailing around the Roman mole and attacking the Roman ships blockading the commercial harbor. It's a brilliant stratagem that might have broken the blockade, but Carthaginian naval skills have eroded during 50 years of peace. The fleet inflicts some damage before withdrawing, but fails to break Roman naval supremacy. A few days later, when the Carthaginians launch a second sortie, Roman ships are ready. In the naval battle that follows, the Carthaginian fleet is destroyed. The harbor channel, bought at such cost, becomes useless. Carthage's last hope of relief is gone. Inside Carthage, conditions deteriorate toward catastrophe. The population, swollen by refugees from the countryside, strains the food supply. Starvation begins to kill the weak, the very young, the elderly, the sick. The city starts to reek of death as bodies pile up faster than they can be buried or burned. Disease spreads through the overcrowded quarters, yet the defenders fight on. When Scipio's troops manage to establish footholds on the walls, Carthaginian militia counterattacks drive them back. When Roman siege towers advance, defenders destroy them with fire. The siege enters its third year, unprecedented in Roman military history. In 146 BCE, spring brings Scipio's final assault. His troops breach the walls near the harbor district and begin fighting their way into the city. The Carthaginians retreat from the walls into the city interior, fortifying buildings and preparing to contest every street, every house. They refuse to surrender or evacuate. If Scipio wants Carthage, he will have to take it building by building, room by room. The final battle for Carthage is about to begin, and it will be among the most horrific urban combats in ancient warfare. Chapter 9. The Death of a City. The street fighting that engulfs Carthage in the spring of 146 BC is unlike anything else in ancient warfare. Most cities, once their walls are breached, surrender. Carthage fights on. Roman legionaries advance through streets barely wide enough for 3 men abreast, facing desperate defenders fighting from windows, rooftops, and doorways. Every building becomes a fortress. Every intersection becomes a killing ground. The Romans, accustomed to open-field battles where discipline and training decide outcomes, find themselves in a grinding urban nightmare where individual courage and savagery matter more than tactics. Scipio Aemilianus implements a methodical strategy of systematic extermination. His troops advance street by street, building by building, clearing each structure before moving to the next. When defenders barricade buildings, Romans set them ablaze, burning out the inhabitants. When Carthaginians retreat to upper stories, Romans demolish the buildings with battering rams and siege equipment brought into the city. The fighting is pitiless. Roman soldiers, frustrated by the prolonged resistance and casualties inflicted by desperate defenders, show no mercy to combatants or civilians. Carthaginian defenders, knowing they face death or slavery regardless, fight without expectation of quarter. The noise must be overwhelming, screaming civilians, the clash of weapons, buildings collapsing, fire crackling through wooden structures. The smell is worse: burning wood, burning flesh, blood, excrement, death. Carthage is being destroyed not just militarily, but physically and spiritually, reduced to hell on earth. The combat continues for 6 days and 6 nights without pause. Roman troops rotate in shifts, advancing relentlessly, while Carthaginian defenders, without relief, fight until they drop from exhaustion or death. The city's geography creates brutal conditions for urban warfare. Carthage is built on a hill rising from the harbors toward the Byrsa citadel. The main street, called the Triple Road because of its width, runs uphill from the harbor to the heights. As Romans advance up this street, Carthaginians hold buildings on both sides, turning the ascent into a gauntlet of projectiles and ambushes. Roman engineers bring the buildings down, filling the street with rubble. Bodies of dead Carthaginians, dead Romans, dead civilians are crushed under falling masonry. Legionaries advancing over this rubble literally walk on corpses, sometimes sinking knee-deep into decomposing flesh. Polybius, the Greek historian who accompanies Scipio as friend and advisor, witnesses the horror firsthand. He records that the living and dead become mixed together in the rubble, that soldiers step on faces and limbs, that the groans of dying people buried in debris haunt the nights. When Romans need to clear streets blocked by demolished buildings, they do an excavate around the bodies. They simply fill the spaces between corpses with more rubble and march over the top. The street becomes a mass grave, and the battle continues above it. By the 6th day, the Romans have fought their way to the base of the Byrsa, the citadel hill where Carthage began 800 years ago. Here, in the sacred precinct where temples to Baal Hammon and Tanit tower over the city, where the palace of the Sephites stands, where the richest aristocrats live in their mansions, approximately 50,000 Carthaginians have taken refuge. They are the survivors fighters who have retreated step by step through the city's destruction, civilians who fled ahead of the Roman advance, priests who refused to abandon the temples, aristocrats who chose death over slavery. Hasdrubal, the Carthaginian commander, has his headquarters in the temple complex. Throughout the siege, he is sworn to fight to the death, declaring that he will never surrender to Rome, that he will die defending Carthage. His rhetoric has inspired the defenders to continue fighting when surrender might have saved lives. Now, trapped on the Byrsa with Roman troops surrounding the hill, Hasdrubal faces the reality of his oaths. The 50,000 Carthaginians on the Byrsa send ambassadors to Scipio, begging for terms. They will surrender if Rome permits them to leave freely. Scipio refuses. They may surrender unconditionally and be enslaved, or they can die. Most choose slavery over death. They descend from the Byrsa in a pitiful column, emaciated from starvation, wounded from the fighting, traumatized by witnessing their city's destruction. Roman soldiers herd them toward the holding areas, where they will await sale as slaves. Approximately 50,000 people, mostly civilians, enter Roman captivity, but some refuse to surrender. About 900 Roman deserters who have fought for Carthage know they face execution rather than slavery. They barricade themselves in the Temple of Eshmon, the great temple that dominates the Byrsa's summit. With them are Hasdrubal, his wife, his 2 sons, and a few hundred Carthaginians who preferred death to submission. The Romans surround the temple. There is no escape, no hope, no possibility except death or capture. Then Hasdrubal breaks. The man who swore eternal defiance, who promised to die rather than surrender, who inspired thousands to fight to the end with his rhetoric, cracks under the weight of his own mortality. He descends from the temple alone, prostrates himself before Scipio, and begs for mercy. He's granted his life, not freedom, but survival as a humiliated captive. From the temple's roof, Hasdrubal's wife witnesses his surrender. The scene that follows becomes one of ancient history's most dramatic moments, recorded by multiple historians. She appears on the rooftop, dressed in full regalia, holding her 2 sons. She shouts down to Hasdrubal, cursing him for his cowardice, damning him for abandoning his oaths and his people. Then she addresses Scipio directly, thanking him for accepting her husband's surrender, because Rome has granted Hasdrubal a fate worse than death, to live in shame, knowing he betrayed everything he claimed to believe. She declares that she and her children will choose honor over life. With both sons held close, she sets fire to the temple. As flames rise around her, she leaps into the conflagration, her children with her. The 900 Roman deserters and remaining Carthaginian defenders perish in the burning temple. The Temple of Eshmon, greatest shrine in Carthage, becomes a funeral pyre for the city's last defenders. Hasdrubal stands below, watching his wife and children burn, living the fate she prophesied survival as shame. Polybius records that Scipio Aemilianus, standing amid the smoking ruins of Carthage, weeps. His friend asks why he weeps at the moment of his greatest triumph. Scipio responds by quoting Homer, "A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and his people shall be slain." When Polybius asks what he means, Scipio explains that he weeps because he foresees that someday someone will stand among Rome's ruins saying the same words. It's a remarkable moment of empathy and foresight. The conquering general, amid total victory, recognizing the impermanence of all civilizations. But if Scipio feels philosophical melancholy, his actions show no mercy. The Senate's orders are clear. Carthage must be destroyed completely. For 17 days, Roman soldiers systematically demolish the city. They burn buildings, topple walls, smash temples. They work with methodical efficiency, reducing 8 centuries of civilization to rubble and ash. The harbor facilities that sheltered hundreds of ships are demolished. The great walls, some sections standing 60 feet high, are thrown down. The aqueducts that brought water to the city are destroyed. Then comes the infamous legend of the salt. Roman historians claim that after razing Carthage, Roman soldiers plow salt into the earth and curse the ground so nothing will grow there, so no one will ever rebuild. Modern historians debate whether this actually happened. Salt is expensive, and cursing farmland makes little economic sense. But whether literal truth or symbolic legend, the story captures Rome's intent. Carthage must not merely be defeated but erased. Removed so completely that future generations will barely remember it existed. The human cost is staggering. Of Carthage's estimated population of 500,000 before the siege, perhaps 150,000 died during the 3 years of siege and the final week of street fighting. Another 50,000 enter slavery. The remaining 300,000 fled to the countryside during the siege or died of disease and starvation before the final assault. The survivors are scattered throughout North Africa, their city destroyed, their nation erased, their identity shattered. Carthaginian culture, Carthaginian language, Carthaginian religion, all will begin fading from history. The territory surrounding Carthage becomes the Roman province of Africa. The city's agricultural hinterland, some of the most fertile land in the Mediterranean, is parceled out to Roman colonists or sold to Roman aristocrats. The ruins of Carthage stand empty for a generation, forbidden ground where locals fear to go, believing the ghosts of the slaughtered haunt the rubble. The great harbors, once sheltering hundreds of ships, fill with silt. The street grid disappears under vegetation. Nature begins reclaiming the ruins of human ambition. In Rome, the victory is celebrated with unprecedented magnificence. Scipio Aemilianus receives a triumph, the traditional parade through Rome's streets displaying the spoils of conquest. But the spoils are modest compared to other triumphs. Carthage's wealth was exhausted by the siege. Most valuables melted down for weapons or consumed in the fires. The most valuable prize is invisible: the elimination of Rome's ancient enemy. Romans can finally believe they are secure, that no power threatens their supremacy, that the nightmare of Hannibal is truly ended. Cato the Elder doesn't witness Carthage's destruction. He died in 149 BCE, just as the siege began. But his life's final campaign succeeds. His obsessive repetition of Carthago delenda est becomes reality. Whether Cato was a strategic genius recognizing a genuine threat or a fearmonger manufacturing enemies to serve, Rome's imperial ambitions, history cannot definitively judge. What is certain is that his vision of Carthage's obliteration is realized beyond even his imagination. The city that rivaled Rome, that nearly destroyed Rome, that represented an alternative Mediterranean civilization, is gone. Chapter 10: The Erasure of Memory. The physical destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE is merely the beginning of its erasure from history. What follows over subsequent centuries is something more insidious and thorough: the systematic elimination of Carthaginian culture, language, literature, and historical memory. Carthage becomes the civilization that vanished twice: once when Rome destroyed the city, and again when Rome destroyed the memory of what Carthage had been. The immediate aftermath of Carthage's fall sees refugees scattered across the Mediterranean. Some Carthaginians flee to other North African cities, Utica, Hadrumetum, Leptis Minor, where they try to maintain their culture and identity. Others are sold into slavery throughout the Roman world, their knowledge and skills dispersed, but their identity as Carthaginians gradually erased. A few escape to Spain or Sardinia, to remote areas where Carthaginian colonial settlements once existed. But these communities are small, isolated, and under Roman control. Without the mother city, without political independence, without institutional support, Carthaginian culture begins to fade. The Carthaginian language, a dialect of Phoenician, survives for several centuries in North Africa, particularly in rural areas. Farmers and peasants continue speaking Punic, the Latin name for the Carthaginian language, long after the city's destruction. Roman authors occasionally mention encountering Punic speakers in North Africa. St. Augustine, writing in the late 4th century CE, over 500 years after Carthage's fall, notes that many North African peasants still speak Punic. But it's a dying language, no longer written, no longer taught formally, no longer a medium for literature or official business. By the 5th century CE, Punic has essentially vanished. leaving only occasional words borrowed into Latin or Berber languages. The complete destruction of Carthaginian literature is the most catastrophic loss. Carthage possessed a sophisticated written culture. They maintained archives, wrote histories, composed religious texts, created agricultural treatises, and produced poetry and drama. Roman authors occasionally reference Carthaginian books. Pliny the Elder mentions that the Roman Senate authorized translating certain Carthaginian agricultural texts into Latin, recognizing their value. A man named Mago wrote a comprehensive agricultural encyclopedia that Romans considered authoritative enough to preserve in translation. But these are exceptions. The vast majority of Carthaginian literature is deliberately destroyed or allowed to disintegrate. When Romans sack Carthage, they burn the libraries. What survives the initial destruction is either taken to Rome as curiosities or left to decay in the ruins. Unlike Greek literature, which Romans admire and preserve, Carthaginian writing is seen as belonging to an enemy civilization. There is no cultural imperative to save it. Within a few generations, virtually all Carthaginian literary works disappear. Today, not a single complete Carthaginian text survives. Everything we know about Carthaginian civilization comes from external sources, mostly Greek and Roman authors who describe Carthage from outside and often with hostile bias. This dependency on hostile sources creates profound problems for reconstructing Carthaginian history. Imagine trying to understand American history using only British accounts written during and immediately after the Revolutionary War, with no American voices preserved. That's essentially the situation with Carthage. Roman historians like Livy, Polybius, who was Greek but wrote for Roman audiences, Appian, and Diodorus Siculus provide detailed accounts of the Punic Wars, but they write from Rome's perspective, with Rome as the protagonist and Carthage as the antagonist. These Roman accounts contain obvious biases and propaganda. Romans consistently portray Carthaginians as perfidious, untrustworthy, cruel, and barbaric. The stereotype of Punic faith, meaning faithlessness, becomes proverbial in Latin. Romans accuse Carthaginians of systematic child sacrifice, though modern archaeology suggests the reality was more complex. Roman sources emphasize Carthage's reliance on mercenaries as evidence of weakness and lack of civic virtue, while downplaying Rome's own extensive use of auxiliary troops. The accounts make Hannibal simultaneously a military genius to glorify Roman resistance, and a cruel barbarian to justify Rome's total destruction of his homeland. Yet these Roman sources, biased as they are, preserve some information that seems authentic. The military histories are detailed enough to allow reconstruction of battles and campaigns. Descriptions of Carthaginian government institutions, the Sophites, the Senate, the Popular Assembly, the court of 104 judges seem plausible and consistent across multiple authors. Details about Carthaginian naval technology, commercial practices, and agricultural methods appear reliable. The challenge is separating probable facts from propaganda, distinguishing between what Romans accurately observed and what they fabricated or misunderstood. Archaeological evidence provides another avenue for understanding Carthage, but archaeology faces its own limitations. The site of ancient Carthage was rebuilt by Romans in 44 BCE under Julius Caesar's orders. A new Roman city, Colonia Julia Carthago, rises on the ruins of the Punic city. This Roman Carthage becomes prosperous, eventually serving as capital of the Roman province of Africa. But building the new city requires excavating and removing much of the old Punic remains. Roman construction crews treat Punic foundations as quarries, extracting building stone. They level Punic structures to create flat surfaces for Roman buildings. Centuries of Roman and later Byzantine occupation further disturb the site. When modern archaeologists excavate Carthage, they must work through these layers of disturbance. They find Punic remains sections of the naval harbor, parts of the city walls, residential buildings. The Tophet, the controversial infant burial ground. But these remains are fragmentary and disturbed. Reconstructing Punic Carthage from these fragments is like assembling a puzzle where most pieces are missing and many remaining pieces are damaged. Still, archaeology provides invaluable evidence that sometimes contradicts or complicates Roman literary sources. The Tophet excavations exemplify both archaeology's value and its limitations. This sacred precinct contains thousands of urns holding cremated infant remains, along with inscriptions dedicating the burials to Tanit and Baal-Hamon. Roman sources claim Carthaginians systematically sacrificed infant children to these deities, particularly in times of crisis. The Tophet's existence seems to confirm these accounts. However, modern analysis reveals complexity. Some burials clearly involve stillborn infants or babies who died naturally in early infancy. Inscriptions sometimes mention illness. The percentage of infant deaths buried in the Tophet roughly matches expected infant mortality rates for ancient populations, suggesting this might be a special cemetery for young children who died naturally, not evidence of mass sacrifice. Yet some burials do appear to involve healthy children who died violently. Some inscriptions use language that seems to reference sacrifice. The debate continues among archaeologists, with some arguing for systematic child sacrifice, others arguing for natural infant mortality cemetery. Still others suggesting the truth involves both a cemetery for infants that occasionally included sacrificed children during extreme circumstances. The point is that without Carthaginian texts explaining their own practices, we must infer meaning from fragmentary evidence, and different scholars reach different conclusions. The religious dimension of Carthage's erasure is particularly thorough. Carthaginian religion, like Carthaginian language and literature, disappears almost completely. We know the names of major deities: Baal-Hamon, Tanit, Melkart, Eshmun, Astarte, but we know little about mythology, ritual practices, or theological concepts. Roman sources describe Carthaginian religion primarily in terms of child sacrifice, emphasizing the most shocking element while ignoring everything else. Archaeological remains show temple layouts and some ritual objects, but without text explaining their significance, interpretation becomes speculation. Later Christian writers complete the religious erasure. Early Christian theologians portray paganism generally as demon worship, but they reserve particular venom for Carthaginian religion, describing it as especially depraved. This serves early Christianity's narrative needs, contrasting Christian civilization with pagan barbarism, but further distorts historical understanding. By late antiquity, Carthaginian religion exists in cultural memory only as a byword for cruelty and depravity, not as a complex belief system worthy of serious study. Political factors accelerate Carthage's erasure from memory. Roman ideology requires portraying Rome's rise to supremacy as historically inevitable and morally justified. Carthage serves as the anti-Rome in this narrative: wealthy but corrupt, powerful but morally bankrupt, clever but untrustworthy. The Punic Wars become morality tales about Roman virtue triumphing over Carthaginian vice. This ideological framework makes preserving authentic Carthaginian perspectives unnecessary and potentially problematic. Better to let the vanquished enemy's voice disappear, replaced by Roman interpretation of what Carthage represented. By the Roman Empire's height in the 2nd century CE, Carthage exists primarily as historical memory, lesson, and cautionary tale. Romans visit the rebuilt Carthage, now a Roman city, and see ruins of Punic walls, but they understand these ruins through Roman narratives. They know Hannibal as Rome's great enemy, but understand him through Roman-authored biographies. They remember the Punic Wars as Rome's great existential crisis, but hear only the Roman side of the story. Carthage becomes what Rome says it was, nothing more. This pattern, victors writing history, is common throughout human civilization, but few cases are as complete as Carthage's erasure. The Persians, defeated by Greeks, still have their own literature preserved. The Germans who fought Rome have archaeological evidence and Roman ethnographic descriptions. The Egyptians and Mesopotamians left monuments and texts that survive for modern archaeology to discover. But Carthage left almost nothing in its own voice. The civilization vanishes behind Rome's narrative, and for 2,000 years, that narrative stands unchallenged. Chapter 11. Carthage's Ghost in 44 BCE. Exactly 1 century after Carthage's destruction, Julius Caesar orders the city's rebuilding. It's a practical decision. The site's strategic location and agricultural hinterland are too valuable to remain abandoned. But it's also symbolic. By rebuilding Carthage as a Roman colony, Caesar demonstrates that Rome has moved beyond fear of its ancient enemy. The new city, Colonia Julia Carthago, represents Rome's absolute victory. Carthage lives again, but only as a Roman creation, speaking Latin, worshipping Roman gods, governed by Roman laws. The Roman Carthage thrives. Within a century, it becomes one of the empire's most prosperous cities, with perhaps 400,000 inhabitants, rivaling Alexandria and Rome itself in size and wealth. It serves as capital of the Roman province of Africa, center of grain production that feeds Rome, and hub of Mediterranean trade. Magnificent Roman buildings rise, a circus that seats 60,000 for chariot races, public baths rivaling Rome's grandest, temples to Roman deities, a forum, theaters, and a sprawling residential district for Roman colonists and Romanized locals. But this Roman Carthage deliberately distances itself from Punic heritage. The language is Latin, not Punic. The gods are Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, not Baal Hammon and Tanit. The architecture follows Roman styles. The government structure mirrors Rome's. Some Punic cultural elements survive in the countryside. The language persists among rural peasants. Some religious practices continue in modified forms. Agricultural techniques remain Carthaginian, but in the city itself, Roman culture dominates. The descendants of those who survived Carthage's fall in 146 BCE, if any remain in the region, have no voice in this new Carthage. They are subsumed into the Roman population, their distinct identity erased. Roman Carthage produces several notable figures who exemplify this cultural transformation. Apuleius, born in North Africa in 124 CE, writes in Latin and becomes famous for his novel, The Golden Ass. Though of North African ancestry, he identifies as Roman. Saint Augustine, born at Thagaste in North Africa in 354 CE, becomes one of early Christianity's most influential theologians. He notes that rural people still speak Punic in his time, but he writes exclusively in Latin and thinks within Roman Christian intellectual frameworks. These men are evidence of how thoroughly Roman civilization has absorbed North Africa. Their connection to ancient Carthage is geographic, not cultural. The question haunts history. What did the world lose when Carthage vanished? What knowledge, what perspectives, what cultural achievements disappeared with the burned libraries and demolished temples? Carthaginian civilization represented an alternative Mediterranean culture, maritime-focused, commercially oriented, Semitic language-based, with different religious traditions and political structures than the Greco-Roman world. Its complete disappearance means we cannot fully appreciate the diversity of ancient Mediterranean civilizations. Carthaginian agricultural knowledge was apparently advanced. Roman authors who translated Carthaginian farming texts acknowledged their sophistication. Carthage, as North African territories, were productive enough to feed the enormous city and export grain throughout the Mediterranean. What techniques did they develop? How did they manage water resources in semi-arid conditions? What crop varieties did they cultivate? Most of this knowledge is lost. Some survived in translation or through practical adoption by Roman farmers. But we cannot know what percentage of Carthaginian agricultural innovation disappeared. Carthaginian navigation and maritime technology likely surpassed Rome's. Carthaginian explorers sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Strait of Gibraltar, into the Atlantic, traveling south along the African coast and north toward Britain. A fragmentary account, the Periplus of Hanno, describes one such voyage, but it's preserved only in a Greek translation and raises as many questions as it answers. How far did Carthaginian explorers travel? What did they discover? What navigation techniques did they develop? The answers died with Carthage. Carthaginian commercial practices and economic organization represented sophisticated systems that Rome partially adopted. The use of subsidiary coinage, banking arrangements, credit instruments, and commercial law all seem to have been more developed in Carthage than in early Rome. Roman merchants and financiers learned from Carthaginian examples. But how much was lost in translation? How many innovations disappeared because no one preserved the theoretical frameworks underlying Carthaginian commercial success? Militarily, Hannibal's campaigns demonstrated strategic and tactical brilliance that Roman commanders studied for centuries. But we see Hannibal only through Roman eyes, filtered through Roman understanding of warfare. What would Hannibal's own account of his campaigns reveal? What strategic principles guided his decisions? What did his failures teach him? Ancient authors mention that Hannibal wrote books after his defeat, possibly memoirs or treatises on military strategy. None survive. We cannot know what wisdom Hannibal might have passed to future generations if his own words had been preserved. Perhaps most significantly, the complete absence of Carthaginian philosophical and religious texts leaves a void in understanding ancient Mediterranean thought. The Phoenician and Carthaginian tradition represented a Semitic cultural perspective that differed from both Greco-Roman and later Jewish and Christian traditions. What did Carthaginians believe about the nature of divinity, human purpose, ethics, the afterlife? How did their religious concepts influence their society? We can speculate based on fragmentary evidence and comparisons with related cultures, but we cannot know with certainty. An entire civilization's spiritual and philosophical worldview has vanished. Rome's victory over Carthage shaped Western civilization in profound ways. Roman law, Latin language, Greco-Roman culture, and later Christianity spread throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, creating frameworks that influenced the modern world. This spread succeeded partly because Rome eliminated alternatives. Carthage represented a different path: maritime commercial empire, Semitic cultural traditions, decentralized political structures. Its elimination narrowed the range of civilizational models available for future societies to learn from or adopt. Some historians argue that Rome's destruction of Carthage was strategically unnecessary and morally indefensible, that Carthage by 149 BCE posed no military threat and could have been left as a prosperous but subordinate state. They point to the peace faction in Rome, led by Scipio Nezica, who argued against Carthage's destruction. They note that Rome's Syrian, Macedonian, and Greek enemies were defeated and subordinated without facing total annihilation. Why was Carthage treated differently? The answer involves Roman trauma from the Punic Wars, especially Hannibal's invasion, which created psychological scars that demanded complete elimination of the threat. Cato, "Se Carthago delenda est," expressed Roman anxiety that refused to dissipate even after Carthage was thoroughly defeated. Other historians defend Rome's decision, arguing that Carthage's commercial recovery represented a genuine long-term threat. They point out that Carthage had rebuilt its wealth in 50 years despite paying massive indemnities, suggesting that given more time, it might rebuild military power. They note that Carthage violated the treaty by raising an army against Numidia, providing legal justification for Rome's actions. From this perspective, Rome acted rationally to eliminate a civilization that had proven itself capable of threatening Rome's existence. The debate is ultimately unresolvable because it involves counterfactuals. What would have happened if Carthage had been left intact? Would it have remained peacefully subordinate, or would it have eventually challenged Rome again? Would a multipolar Mediterranean with multiple powerful civilizations have been more stable or less stable than the Roman hegemony that actually emerged? History cannot answer these questions because Rome's choice to destroy Carthage made alternative futures impossible. What is certain is that Carthage's destruction established a precedent that Rome would repeat. The total elimination of an enemy state, the systematic destruction of its culture, the erasure of its historical voice, these became part of Rome's repertoire. Later, Rome would utterly destroy Corinth in Greece the same year as Carthage's fall, 146 BCE, would devastate Jerusalem and scatter the Jewish population, would crush barbarian tribes so thoroughly that only Roman accounts of them survive. Carthage was not the first civilization Rome destroyed, but it was the most complete destruction, the template for how Rome would deal with enemies it particularly feared or hated. Ironically, while Carthage vanished, its conqueror also eventually fell. Rome, seemingly invincible in 146 BCE, fragmented into civil wars within a century. The Roman Republic collapsed, replaced by empire. The empire itself eventually split, with the western half falling to barbarian invasions in 476 CE. The eastern half, the Byzantine Empire, survived until 1453 CE, but it spoke Greek and looked more to Constantinople than Rome. Latin survived as a learned language and as Romance language's ancestor, but the Roman world Scipio Aemilianus knew disappeared as thoroughly as Carthage, just more slowly. Carthage's fate reminds us that no matter how powerful, how wealthy, how culturally sophisticated a civilization becomes, it can vanish. Sometimes defeat comes dramatically, in siege and slaughter. Sometimes it comes gradually, through cultural assimilation and language death. Often it comes through both violent destruction followed by cultural erasure. Carthage experienced the most complete version: military annihilation, cultural elimination, and historical silencing. It stands as warning and lament, warning about hubris and the costs of conflict. Lament for all that is lost when civilizations disappear. The kingdom of Carthage did not simply vanish from history. It was methodically erased from existence by a rival civilization that feared what Carthage represented. For nearly 700 years, from its legendary founding by Queen Dido in 814 BCE to its apocalyptic destruction in 146 BCE, Carthage stood as the Mediterranean's premier maritime and commercial power. It built an empire spanning 3 continents, developed sophisticated agricultural and navigational technologies, accumulated wealth that made it the envy of the ancient world, and produced generals like Hannibal Barca, whose military genius remains legendary millennia later. Yet today, almost nothing remains in Carthage's own voice. We reconstruct this lost civilization from fragments, hostile Roman accounts, scattered archaeological remains, fading inscriptions in a dead language. The libraries were burned, the temples demolished, the population killed or scattered. Within generations, even the language began disappearing. Within centuries, Carthaginian culture existed only as Roman memory and Roman interpretation. The civilization that nearly destroyed Rome was itself destroyed so completely that we know it primarily through its enemy's eyes. The story of Carthage's disappearance begins with collision two rising powers, Rome and Carthage, competing for supremacy in the central Mediterranean. Neither could tolerate the other's dominance. 3 catastrophic wars followed, spanning over a century, costing hundreds of thousands of lives, bankrupting both states repeatedly. Carthage won brilliant victories, particularly under Hannibal, who brought Rome closer to destruction than any enemy before or after. But Rome possessed something Carthage lacked: the absolute refusal to accept defeat regardless of cost. When Hannibal's genius couldn't overcome Roman determination, Carthage's fate was sealed. The Second Punic War left Carthage defeated but alive, reduced to a client state paying tribute to Rome. For 50 years, Carthage accommodated Roman supremacy, paid its indemnities early, rebuilt its commercial prosperity, and hoped to preserve independence through compliance. But Rome couldn't forgive or forget. Roman senators, particularly Cato the Elder, obsessed over Carthage's continued existence. When Carthage finally gave Rome the slightest pretext, raising an army without permission, Rome demanded not just submission but annihilation. The siege and destruction of Carthage in 149–146 BCE represents one of ancient history's most brutal urban combats. For 3 years, Carthaginians resisted siege, improvising weapons from temple decorations, fighting building by building through their city streets, choosing death over slavery. When Rome finally breached the walls, 17 days of street fighting followed, turning Carthage into hell on earth. Approximately 150,000 died during the siege and final assault. Another 50,000 entered slavery. The survivors scattered across North Africa, losing their identity within generations. But physical destruction alone didn't erase Carthage from history. What followed was systematic cultural obliteration. Rome demolished every building, scattered the population, prohibited rebuilding. When Rome eventually did reconstruct Carthage a century later, it built a Roman city speaking Latin and worshipping Roman gods. Carthaginian literature was burned or allowed to decay. Not a single complete Carthaginian text survives today. The language faded over centuries, surviving only in rural dialects before finally disappearing. Carthaginian religion, philosophy, and cultural traditions vanished with no one to preserve or transmit them. The victors wrote Carthage's history, and they wrote it to serve Roman purposes. Romans portrayed Carthaginians as perfidious, cruel, and barbaric, convenient characterizations that justified total destruction. Modern historians, lacking Carthaginian voices, must work from these biased sources, archaeological fragments, and informed speculation. We can partially reconstruct what Carthage was, but we cannot fully know what was lost, what innovations in agriculture, navigation, commerce, or thought disappeared with the burned libraries. Carthage's erasure holds lessons that resonate across millennia. It demonstrates that military defeat can be followed by cultural annihilation, that the historical record is written by survivors, that entire civilizations can vanish when powerful enemies combine physical destruction with cultural suppression. It shows how psychological trauma Rome's terror during Hannibal's invasion can drive policy decades later, turning former enemies into existential threats that must be eliminated completely. It reveals how easily sophisticated civilizations disappear when no one preserves their voice. The irony is that while Carthage vanished, Rome also eventually fell. The seemingly invincible empire that destroyed Carthage fragmented, collapsed, and was overrun by barbarians within 6 centuries. Today, we study both civilizations as ancient history, ruins to excavate and texts to interpret. Rome left vastly more evidence: monuments, literature, legal codes, languages descended from Latin, but it too is gone. The difference is one of degree, not kind. All civilizations are temporary. Some merely vanish more completely than others. The question haunts: what did humanity lose when Carthage died? We know we lost agricultural treatises, navigation accounts, commercial practices, military strategies, philosophical ideas, religious traditions, and historical perspectives. We cannot know what we don't know, what innovations or insights disappeared so thoroughly that we cannot even identify the absence. The gap in Mediterranean cultural history, where Carthaginian civilization should exist, reminds us how fragile cultural transmission is, how easily knowledge vanishes when not deliberately preserved. Carthage vanished from history through a combination of military catastrophe and cultural erasure. Rome destroyed the city, scattered its people, and silenced its voice. Within centuries, Carthage existed primarily as Roman memory, the dangerous enemy that justified Roman supremacy, the civilization whose destruction proved Roman power. Today, scholars work to recover fragments of authentic Carthaginian history from beneath layers of Roman propaganda and cultural forgetting. We can partially resurrect this lost civilization through archaeology and critical analysis of hostile sources, but we can never fully restore what Rome took such pains to eliminate. The ruins of Carthage, now a suburb of modern Tunis in Tunisia, stand as monument and warning. Tourists walk through the remains of the Roman city built over Punic foundations. Visit museums displaying artifacts from both civilizations and contemplate the complete destruction one people can inflict upon another. The Mediterranean laps its shores that once sheltered the ancient world's greatest fleet. The hills where Hannibal trained as a boy overlook beaches where Roman legions landed. The Tophet, controversial burial ground, raises questions about ancient practices that no Carthaginian voice can answer. These fragments are all that physically remains of nearly 7 centuries of civilization. But Carthage's ghost haunts Western civilization in subtler ways. Every time we reference Hannibal crossing the Alps, we invoke Carthaginian memory. Every time historians warn about victors writing history, Carthage exemplifies the danger. Every time we contemplate what is lost when civilizations destroy each other completely, Carthage serves as the paradigmatic example. The very completeness of its erasure makes it memorable. The civilization that vanished so thoroughly that vanishing became its defining characteristic. The kingdom of Carthage vanished from history because Rome willed it so. Rome possessed the military power to destroy the city, the political determination to prevent its rebuilding, and the cultural dominance to control how Carthage would be remembered. But complete erasure proved impossible. Even without Carthaginian texts or voices, even filtered through hostile sources, enough evidence survives to tell the story of this lost civilization. Carthage cannot speak for itself, but it can still be heard through careful scholarship that respects what was lost and acknowledges the limits of what can be recovered. In the end, Carthage's disappearance tells us much about Rome as about Carthage itself, about Roman fear, Roman ruthlessness, Roman historical narrative, and Roman civilizational insecurity. Rome destroyed Carthage because it could, because it feared Carthaginian revival, and because eliminating the last major challenger to Roman supremacy served ideological purposes. The thoroughness of Carthage's destruction reflects not Carthaginian weakness, but Roman anxiety. You don't methodically erase a civilization unless it represented something genuinely threatening, genuinely alternative, genuinely significant. Carthage mattered enough to be destroyed completely, and that total destruction paradoxically preserves its historical importance. The civilization that vanished from history remains, in its very absence, impossible to forget.